What's up everyone, I'm Gushy and welcome to the channel. In this video, we're me going over some combat tips and tricks for God of War Ragnarok. Now these tips are very playstyle specific and should be general rules of thumb no matter what build you're running, as these playstyle choices aren't really gear specific. Because of that, and because it works at the very beginning of the game, as you progress and get stronger weapons and better gear, these tips will make you that much more powerful. So getting straight into it and into the first and I think most important tip is understanding stuns. Stuns are arguably the strongest effect in the game, as it keeps enemies immobilized and more importantly keeps your combo chains going so you can do more damage. Now to use stuns the most effective way possible, the thing we have to know is when to use stuns and how we can stun enemies. So first let's quickly go over how we can stun enemies. There are several ways, first which is parrying. Believe it or not, parrying is actually an AoE, or area of effect, which can hit multiple enemies at once. It is a pretty small radius, but a really good thing to know, especially when fighting multiple enemies at once. Second is your runic attacks. You get runic attacks for both your Blaze of Chaos and your Leviathan Axe pretty early on into the game. So you should have 4 runic attacks, 1 light, 1 heavy for each weapon, as an additional stun but on cooldown. Finally, the last way you can stun enemies is with the Dauntless Shield's ability Shield Bash. I know I said this isn't gear specific, but this is literally one of the first weapons you get in the game, and is such a great ability to use. After you get a parry, you can double tap L1 to Shield Bash for very high stun damage. You could kind of see how it works in the gear video description, but this is not the way you should be using it. Because your parry and your Shield Bash are separate stuns, you don't want to be using them back to back. For basic mobs, parries usually stun enemies for around 3 seconds, and the Shield Bash along with the knockback gives you around 5 seconds of a stun. So if you do use the parry straight to the Shield Bash, you're only using that 5-second duration on the Shield Bash. However, if you stagger these stuns, you can essentially get 8 full seconds of stun. So the ideal loop is to parry, get the 3 seconds of stun duration, get as many attacks in as possible. After those 3 seconds are done, then you go for the Shield Bash, which then gives you another 5 seconds of stun. The parry and the Shield Bash are not reliant on a cooldown, so you will be using these abilities the most. However, since the runic attacks are on cooldown, I highly recommend using them first, so you can use them more times within a fight. Before we move on, if you find these tips helpful, please drop a like on this video, and check out our God of War playlist, because we have a bunch of other videos on God of War that help you throughout the game. And next, moving on to my second tip, and this is to keep the enemies in front of you. Of course, this does make sense since you don't want to get hit in the back, but more importantly, which ties into the stuns, are that most of your stuns are an AoE in front of you. Again, your parry and your Shield Bash are AoEs in front of you, so you want to keep as many enemies in your line of sight, so you're hitting as many enemies as possible, and you're not having to worry about enemies hitting you from the side or in the back while you're trying to do damage while enemies are stunned. In this next fight, we're going up against this mini-boss who is not relevant to the story at all, so this is not a spoiler. But as you progress through the story, you'll be fighting multiple enemies at once, some stronger than others, and this is a really good example of those. So my third tip is to focus the weaker enemies first. Of course, focusing the weaker enemies does thin out the numbers and the mobs, but more importantly, this leads back to the stuns again. Weaker enemies are a lot easier to parry, and are way more forgiving if you miss a parry. Stronger enemies usually throw out more guard breaking attacks and unblockable attacks, so targeting weaker enemies just for the parry to get your Shield Bash is a lot easier to do. Now sometimes it may be a little bit hard to focus one enemy at a time, but a really easy way to separate enemies from each other is to use your environment to your advantage. I'd say in about 50% of fights, there are multiple levels that you can climb to. And to be honest, enemies are really slow when climbing or dropping down to or from a different height. Not only does it leave them vulnerable when they are climbing up or down, but it also isolates enemies, as most of the time they climb up one by one. So again, use this to your advantage to get those parries in, charge up that Shield Bash, and reduce the amount of enemies you're fighting at once. Alright, moving on to my fourth tip is knowing when to parry and when to dodge. Usually people would prefer one over the other, but in God of War Ragnarok you really have to take advantage of using both parrying and dodging. We kind of already went over the importance of parrying, but dodging is important because it does provide you with invincibility frames or iframes to avoid enemy unblockable attacks indicated by the red circle, which most of the time comes in the form of AoE attacks. I believe the timing is pretty similar to parrying, but because enemy unblockable attacks are mostly AoEs, if you don't time them perfectly, you will get hit. Now the safest option is to double tap X to do a roll, and it's pretty much your oh shit button. But what I highly recommend is practicing the timing and picking up the skill Whirlwind Storm. You can get this skill almost immediately, but it's important because the attack comes out way faster than if you just attack normally, essentially increasing the amount of damage dealt. Whirlwind Storm is for the Leviathan Axe, and the Blades of Chaos has an equivalent skill in the melee tree called Spinning Chaos. This move does take a little bit time to get used to, so just practice using it a bit, so you can use it consistently after you dodge. Finally, for my fifth and last tip is to know when to use light and heavy attacks. Now most of the time, I prefer using light attacks, as it does give you more time after you attack to dodge or parry if needed, but it is important to know when to use your heavy attacks, especially because they can stun specific enemies. Usually the lowest of low enemies can only get stunned by heavy attacks, and this is the time to use it. As you progress through the game, most bosses and commander level enemies don't get stunned by heavy attacks. In these clips, all these enemies don't take stun damage from heavy attacks, so in the gameplay you are seeing me lean towards more light attacks. With that, I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you have your own tips and tricks, please drop them down in the comment section down below. I hope you're enjoying the game just as much as I am. Again, hit that subscribe button if you are enjoying the content and you want to stay up to date with all the videos that we post. As always, thank you guys for watching. Hope to catch you in the next one, and GG.